Welcome, everyone, to the Project Censored Radio Show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Matthew Hoh, who's the Associate Director of the Eisenhower Media Network and an Emeritus Senior Fellow with the Center for International Policy. He is a disabled Marine Corps combat veteran, and in 2009, Matt resigned his post with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest over the escalation of that war. Matt, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me with you, Eleanor.
Folks might recall that I spoke about Matt in a previous episode when I was discussing the lack of democracy in our voting system in the United States. But today we are inviting Matt onto the show to discuss something different, but of course interconnected with regards to democracy and imperialism. And so, Matt, we talk a lot about war and specifically the Iraq War on Project Censored, the WMD lies that push us into it, the creation of terrorists in order to perpetuate war crimes, etc. So what I want to get into that's a bit different than what we typically talk about is to start off with the psychology of this, because it's one thing for me and listeners like me who have never been in the military and have done a lot of peace work, that, yeah, war is bad and you shouldn't do it. But
Right.
but the psychology, the U.S. culture of romanticizing war is still very loud and present as we look at the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq invasion. And it ensnares the imaginations of millions of Americans, many who go on to enlist in the military. And as the popular anti-war slogan goes, I'm already against the next war. And if
Right.
we are going to be against that war and these wars, we got to throw a wrench into that culture of violence, this psychology of war. So to start off with, Matt, can you talk a little bit about this culture of violence that brings people in to the military, that starts off these endless wars?
Yeah, absolutely. It is, from the time that we start to have a consciousness about ourselves and how we fit into society, how we fit into our communities, what we aspire to be, we've already been inundated with all this type of messaging, conditioning, the culture, the romanticism of it all. So I'm old enough, I grew up in New Jersey and New York in Channel 5, Channel 9, Channel 11. I'm old enough to have watched like the black and white Westerns and the World War II movies that they would show on Saturday afternoons. That type of, just one example of the type of romanticism we're talking about here, the cultural romanticism, and then you add in other aspects of our society. Plus, I think there's a real certain human condition, human aspect of this, where you look at nation states going back. And I know that there's a lot of work out there that shows violence is not the predisposed condition of humans. However, possibly for nation states, it is. And then that type of how that filters down, how it affects us and how we see ourselves in our community, as well as then, there's a peculiar aspect of being a man and wanting to be a leader, improving yourself and so forth. So I think there's another part of this too that I speak about a lot, or I've come to understand, is that we tend to see our generations as being different. We tend to believe that we will not do what those before us have done. So you can understand the line of history, you can understand American imperialism, American empire, but still somehow believe that your generation will be different. And certainly that's how I was. That's how stupid I was, maybe how cowardly I was in terms of not, kind of really critiquing that notion I had. It was a lie. It's an excuse, but it was prevalent. And I went in the Marine Corps in January 1998, and I had, at that point, you had colonels and generals and sergeants major who had been in Vietnam. And all of them, to a man, stood in front of us and said, we would never do that again. The United States will never do another war like Vietnam, right? Just as Korean War vets said the same thing too, just as veterans of the Spanish-American War said the same type of thing. We will never do a war like what we did in the Philippines ever again. So, I think that lying to ourselves about us, about who we are, what we do, where we fit in, that somehow our generation is different, contributes to this overall cultural conditioning that we have to somehow think that violence can be a force for good. And I'm a big fan of the theologian Walter Wink. And, he spoke a lot. He wrote a lot about the myth of redemptive violence. And you could see that Wink critiqued Star Wars quite a bit, film that was integral to me growing up. It shaped what I thought leadership should be, what I thought purpose should be, what I thought I should be, right? Who I thought we were as a society. We're on the side of the rebellion. We're not the evil empire, right? I mean, so those kinds of things. And Wink critiques that in this idea, and it's as clear as what he says it is. It's a myth of redemptive violence. So somehow we can use violence to attain justice, violence to attain some type of reconciliation or retribution, violence to attain some kind of reparation, violence for the good. And I think so many of us are conditioned that way. And I certainly was, even though intellectually and academically, I didn't quite believe it. But again, I thought we were different. One of the many lies I told myself that allowed me to take part and participate in the Iraq War and then the Afghan War.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's so incredibly powerful, that like cognitive dissonance that, like you said, that you didn't academically or intellectually believe it, but then at the same time, you were throwing yourself into it because, of course, this is different. I'm different. We're different. And this is a totally different situation. And there we have, history repeating itself, as you pointed out, in the long line of unnecessary wars that the U.S. has started and fought.
Right, and there's another aspect too I want to just address real quick, Eleanor, because I think many people will see this as well. The discourse that we have in our public intellectualism, the discourse that our establishment allows, that our public schools and our private colleges allow. So I could be the high school history, I could be my high school class history honor winner, right? I could go to a very good private college, and I could never have read Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn or Malcolm X or Angela Davis, right? You know those names, but they are associated from the establishment sources as fringe. Chris Hedges talks about how, there are certain people that the New York Times, when he was a journalist for the Times for all those decades, there are certain people at times you never would be allowed to ever call for comment, Noam Chomsky being one of them, say, or Howard Zinn, another one. So you can have an excellent education relative to our standards, right? You can have read so much. You can do as I did, subscribe to the major and leading publications of the day. I used to get the New York Times delivered to my home. When I was 15 years old, I had a subscription to The Economist, right? And things like that. Had subscriptions to The Atlantic. Had subscriptions to the New Yorker, these very prominent, important establishment, and they would have people who write in them that were somehow seen as critiquing our overall system, or that their conversations would be deemed as kind of cutting edge or, contentions. But the reality was it was all within what's it called? The Overton window, right? It was all within the allowable discourse. There was no one ever pointing to the great crimes of the empire, any type of critique like that, just to say a critique of capitalism, a critique of, was just not simply allowed. So you could talk about, say, economics, the failures of the American auto industry, but overall, you couldn't discuss the greater issues of the failures of the American economic system. So, you had that as well. I think that really helps shape people for going into the military, for allowing themselves to deceive themselves, to willingly do it, and then get to such a point. This is one thing I want people to really understand. Get to such a point that you are deceiving yourself, but you don't have the guts to step forward through it. You don't have the wherewithal to break that. And of course, the military does quite a lot to condition people. So, 20 years ago, a young man goes into the Army infantry or to the Marine Corps infantry. If he goes into the Marine Corps infantry, he goes through 13 weeks of recruit training. He goes through, I think it was 8 weeks of advanced infantry training. And then he goes to his unit. And all that unit does is practice to kill every day. That's all they do. And the training is a scientifically, academically academically described discipline in order to ensure that these young men are being conditioned to not just obey, but to kill without thought, to kill without recourse. That, of course, is only good in the moment. This is why I don't use the term brainwashing, because they're conditioned. Because when you come home, when you leave that and you're out of the bubble, you're out of the group think, right? You're out of that culture, that begins to break down. And this is one of the reasons why you see so many veteran suicides.
Yeah, that's that, and your point actually brings me to my next question, because this is something that I've spoken to other veterans about as well, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, because, we're told as non-military folks, oh, your job is to put a yellow ribbon on your car and to thank veterans for their service and to just basically pedestal them. But in the kind of way where they don't get actual help. I mean, you're not supposed to like push your Congress people to vote to give more money to the VA. Like, you just thank you for your service and put on the yellow ribbon. How do you feel that that coming home, like, what is that? I know it's probably impossible to describe to someone who hasn't lived it, but that extreme shift coming back to the culture that pedestals this kind of horrific violence, and to have that turmoil going on within yourself. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That dissonance is horribly destructive. And actually, when I was in Iraq with my Marine Corps company, we had a satellite dish to get television at our company headquarters, and we got a bunch of different channels. One of them was Fox News. I don't know how we got that. We didn't get anything else, besides different movie channels and
Fox found a way to you.
Yeah, exactly. But, one day my first sergeant, and this was in 2006, my first sergeant says to me, he says, "Hey, sir, you know what? I'm not going to put that Fox News channel on any longer." And I said, "Okay, yeah, why?" And he said, "Because it's upsetting the Marines." And what he meant was the dissonance between the propaganda they were hearing and what they were living, what they were experiencing in Iraq. You go and you think you're going to be wearing a white hat, and you realize that you're wearing a black hat. You come home, and this is really one of the things that really disturbs and distresses so many combat veterans. Particularly, this is one of the foundational aspects of, say, moral injury, which is a clinical term for guilt, shame, regret of such magnitude that it's as if your moral foundations have been completely ripped out. And this is what many people, a lot of studies, a lot of research, the VA is working on this more, the effects of killing, what this does to a person's mind and soul. And many people, including myself, believe this is the leading reason for combat veteran suicides. I don't know anyone, I was suicidal. It was because of the guilt I had from what I did. I don't know anyone who's been through this who is putting a gun in their mouth because they feel scared because a bomb went off and now they can't shake that fear. It's about guilt, whether it be survivor's guilt or guilt as a perpetrator, what's called perpetrators induced traumatic stress, which sets apart combat veterans from so many other people who've experienced trauma, because you're a perpetrator. Right. And so, you come home and you're struggling with this. You're starting to realize that you leave the military, you're out of that bubble, you're out of that groupthink. And these things, you've got these thoughts inside your head. What you believe doesn't match up with your experience. You try and close the door on it. I think we all know what happens when we try and close doors on our mind, right? Eventually that door knocked down. The distress is amazing. But then what you have, though, to your point, Eleanor, is that you go to a baseball game, you go to a hockey game, and you're asked to stand up so that everyone can clap because you're a hero. And in your mind, you're saying, "I just took part in organized murder. I just took part in the willful destruction of a people and their nation." So you have that dissonance exist between what the veteran is coming home, grappling with what they just did, what they perpetrated, and what society, the American society is. Well, they're all heroes. You're all heroes. It's almost it's religious. This type of obsequious response to the military, this deference to the military. People say, "Thank you for your service to me," as if it is a ritual obligation. It is, I use that term very deliberately, that it's religious. And I want to also say, though, because on the anniversary of the Iraq War, I shouldn't even say Iraq War, it's Iraq invasion, because the war against Iraq by the United States stretches back through the 70s and continues now. But this idea that I think something that troubles, I think, a lot of us who talk about the war from the American veteran perspective is something that Tobias Wolff wrote about years ago. Tobias Wolff, famous author, of course, he was also an Army officer in the Vietnam War. And in one of his memoirs, he relates a story about he and his unit destroying Vietnamese homes. And he's telling it to people back here. And he basically comes to this idea, this notion that troubles so many of us, that he said it's a peculiar American notion that American boys would go overseas, destroy other people's homes, and then come home and want people to feel sorry for them. And so it's a very difficult thing a lot of times to talk about this, because you feel as if you're centering yourself, you're centering this American experience. I'm centering what I did as a perpetrator, and that leaves out the victims. I think if we were to survey, say, American media this past week, so much of it has been devoted towards the American experience in Iraq. And you really have to go to independent outlets, say something like Democracy Now!, which is putting forth Iraqi voices, Iraqi stories of the war. Also, too, you have this real American aspect to compartmentalize everything, to give arbitrary start dates for different historical periods, so that the war in Iraq does not begin until March 19, 2003. The fact that the United States, under the Clinton administration, have been bombing Iraq every third day throughout the entire Clinton administration, the fact that the Clinton administration had begun 13 years of sanctions that continued up through 2003, that killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, according to multiple studies. The first Iraq war, which just killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and ruined, it just devastated Iraqi infrastructure. The Iran-Iraq war, which is a proxy war for the Americans, which killed over 1 million people, devastated entire cities, on, back into the 70s, where, Chris Hedges reminded me of this just a week or two ago. The United States, the Nixon administration, starts arming the Kurds in 1972 to cause instability in Baghdad, to try and overthrow the government. That lasts for a number of years. I was born in 1973. So if I was an Iraqi, my entire life would have been dominated by the American government trying to use violence against my country and my people, and creating, in the best moments, political instability, but mostly creating just incredible death and suffering. And it even still, you see I sent off an angry note to The Hill a week or two ago, because they define the Iraq War, as they call it, from 2003 to 2011, as if everything that came afterwards was some type of event that just organically occurred, just like the weeds that are coming up in my garden right now just happened. The Islamic State just had nothing to do with anything. And then we came back in, and the whole notion of the American Air Force and American Navy destroying every city in Western Iraq and Northern Iraq from 2014 to 2017 is just glanced over, as if it was just some type of, addendum to what occurred after 2011. And so, I think the way we look at this, we look at ourselves, the way we look at others, and the way we look at our history, I think is very instructive to understand how easy it is as a nation for us to go overseas, destroy entire regions, stomping throughout the greater Middle East, stomping throughout the Muslim world, and just destroying people without any type of observation on our part.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting all that, and I really appreciate what you said.
1 second, let me let my dog out. Excuse me.
So I also really appreciate what you said about centering the American experience in Iraq as opposed to centering the Iraqi experience. And of course, I'm talking to you during this interview, so I'm very clearly centering not just the American military experience, but yours specifically. And I wanted to do that specifically because I really feel that your insight is something that we as Americans can grab a hold of. In a lot of ways, it's easier for people to grab a hold of stories and experiences that are shared in some ways. And I've noticed this in organizing that people get this like trauma overload. You know, they see pictures from Gaza, they see pictures from Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. And it's not that we shouldn't have that information. It's just that people get this trauma overload. But then if you tell them that Steve down the street, who they grew up with, is struggling with this extreme what did you say it was? Moral injury, and this is what happens when we engage in these endless wars. Like it's not just something that happens far away. Like this is something that has become so much of a fabric of our society at this point, because I'm in my mid-30s. I've more than half my life has been lived with perpetual war, particularly if you consider it the way that you painted it, which really we've been at war basically the entire U.S. existence, except for like a few years here and there. Right. But so I think that this is also a powerful tool in terms of anti-war organizing, because we can talk about like, hey, we don't want our neighbors and our friends' kids and things like this to be on the receiving end of this horror that is to perpetuate war. So I'm also curious in that same vein, like, how do you feel that you can reach out to people who are thinking about the military, not just because of the culture of violence, but also because of the very insidious economic draft that exists in this country?
A number of years ago, my friend said, "Hey, my stepson is thinking about going into the military." And he's like, "You want to talk to him?" And I just sent him a photo of all the different medications I take. And I said, "Do you want to be, 45, 46 years old?" This is a few years ago, taking 20 pills a day. Thank God I don't take that anymore, but yeah, that type of really explaining what this is about, that this is such it's a culture of violence where the escalation of that violence is part of the institution, where there is violence at all levels, and the supremacy of violence is what dominates how the hierarchy is formed, if you will. You can see this, say, with military sexual trauma, where the numbers are that approximately 1 in 3 women will be raped, assaulted, or the victim of sexual harassment in their time in the military. And remember, most women are in the military for 3 to 5 years. I mean, so think about how forceful that is. 1 in 50 men will experience military sexual trauma. So and sheer numbers, more men are sexually assaulted and raped every year in the military than women are, just because there are so many more men. But it's also, too, it's prevalent. And what it is when they look at it, and this is where, people will rightly critique the military about how poorly they have done. And they've done so poorly with military sexual trauma, assault, rape, harassment, because they've chosen not to do anything about it. It's ingrained in their system. But when they look at it and they're honest in their studies, what they find is more than likely a young Marine, he or she will be raped by one of their own superiors. Most of the sexual assault and rape that occurs in the military doesn't occur, and I think this is the case in the civilian world too, but doesn't occur from some stranger in a dark part of a barracks or in an alley somewhere. Comes from someone in your squad. And as the Marine Corps found out, I think the Army finds that well, and the other branches too, it comes from superior. So this is actually another aspect of the moral injury we talk about, because, you have young men or women who join the military. They're led to believe that they're a part of a brotherhood or in a sisterhood, this team where they're going to die for each other, as well as all the great things the institution says about itself, about taking care of one another and whatnot. And then, of course, then they're raped by one of their own superiors or someone in their squad or whoever. And then the institution betrays them again. I mean, so you have multiple levels of betrayal, where that compounds. And if there's ability then to communicate that, and I think the way to do that is through art, through film, certainly through programs like this. But I think the depiction of the reality of it, so that more young men and women understand what the actual military is as an institution of violence and how that will be used against them potentially, not just directed outward. I think that is something that we find ways to do. And of course, the military, the Pentagon, is well aware of this. And so what has the Pentagon done, as many people know, there's a new film coming out. I can't remember what it's called, but the Pentagon has co-opted Hollywood. Right. So the Hollywood receives hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially billions of dollars a year in subsidies from the Pentagon. A film like, if people remember about 10 years ago, the Tom Hanks movie, Captain Phillips, where the Navy SEALs come in and they kill the Somali pirates and everything else. That film supposedly had about $50 million in subsidies from the U.S. Navy. Right. Because they let the filmmakers use their ships. They let them use their sailors. Hey, you know what's great when you use sailors? You don't have to pay movie workers at union wages. You get to use the sailors for free, right? I mean, so all these, in exchange for that, the Pentagon has supervision of scripts. So if you've got the next Transformer film coming up, you're not worried about the Transformer film not being pro-military enough that they're not going to lend you a bunch of F-35s. What you're worried about is that someone is going to produce a film in your studio, Sony Pictures, Disney, whoever, that is going to talk about veteran suicides, or it's going to talk about veteran war crimes, or it's going to talk about military sexual trauma in the Army. And you do that, the Pentagon's not going to let you have those F-35s. So what they've done is, it's not just that they control the superhero movies and the war movies and all that. What they do is they control the entire studio because it's so much money. So that what you're up against here is a living organism. When you talk about particularly, say, recruiting, what you're also up against is a massive public relations department within the Pentagon that is roughly 7 to 8 times bigger than any private public relations firm in the world. A number of years ago, the Pentagon's PR budget, which includes recruiting and a whole host of other things, was about $7 or $8 billion. And the largest PR firm in the world was about $900 million. Right. I mean, so what you're up against here, we have to really understand this Leviathan that will do everything it can to survive and grow. And of course, it doesn't care who it crushes. And if that means bringing young men and women in and destroying them, body, mind, and soul, well, that's just how it operates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reminded that the Pentagon, the DoD actually put something, there was a web page that bragged about their good relations with Hollywood. We are very proud to be a part of the Hollywood. And I'm like, wow, you're just putting it out there that we propagandize the hell out of you guys and you'd accept it. You eat it up. And I'm like, wow, that's very honest of you.
Oh, they've done all kinds of things. Their recruiting is tied into Hollywood in many different ways. Years ago, the Pentagon, I think, talking about decades ago, the Pentagon was concerned about the image, and then a little bit concerned that they got the salutes correct and the uniforms looked okay. And then the big change, of course, was Top Gun, almost 40 years ago. And of course, the remake just came out last year, which was the biggest film of last year, I think. And the recruiting numbers when Top Gun came out were absolutely bananas. The Navy and the Air Force had about an 8 or 9% increase in recruiting after that film comes out, And, so you see it not just with those films that are explicitly military, but also too with the superhero movies, and there's been recruiting ties in with many of the different, whether DC Comics or Marvel or whoever, because there is a idea of, again, this myth of redemptive violence, right? This idea of going out there and using physical force to create good. I mean, a number of years ago, I don't know if they still use it or not, the Navy's slogan was a force for good, right? So they show these aircraft taking off aircraft carriers, submarines, Navy SEALs, whatever, a force for good, right? So again, using the mythology of the United States, putting it into terms. And then, of course, we haven't even gotten into all the video games that are out there that the Pentagon has been involved with, quite hand in glove type of thing, because they also see the real value in recruiting. The great thing is that the Pentagon for most of the last 15 years has had real troubles recruiting. And last year, the Army missed its recruitment number by about 25%. They're having a lot of difficulty in recruiting young men and women. They are now recruiting at the lowest levels they have recruited at since Vietnam in terms of the qualifications. So you have a real difficulty for the military to bring in people. 80% of people who join the military are young men and women who have family members in the military. So you have this an ever increasing closed group of people that the U.S. military is recruiting from. And, when they're candid about it, and there's also the economic draft, the military, the Pentagon is really good at hiding that. Just to give you an example of how they do that, they claim that their recruits are representative of every economically representative of the entire nation, right? That the way they do that is that if you were to join the Army, Eleanor, what they would do is they would give you, in terms of your income, your household income, how they would assign that to you. They wouldn't ask you, how much do you make? Or they would just say, oh, you're from this zip code. The median, right? So every recruit who joins the U.S. military has the median income assigned to them of their zip code. And then they turn around and say, isn't this fantastic? Our recruits all have the median income of this nation. They're completely representative of our people. And we're not taking, there's no economic draft. We're not taking from the poor, which is just complete nonsense and utter lie. And you talk to any of the guys that do recruiting, they'll tell you they go once a year to the wealthy white high school because they have to. And they spend all their time at the poor white high schools, the black high schools, and the Latino high schools, because that's where they get their people from. And the thing is, too, it's kind of outmoded because most recruits going into the military aren't coming out of high school. Most of them have been out of high school for a couple of years. So most of your recruits coming out of the military are people who've been out and around now and are looking for something, right? And many of them, it's economic. Others, it's because it's a way to get out. Others, because they want to prove themselves. It's interesting the way you talk to recruiters, how they do it. They go to a Latino high school, and the emphasis is going to be on learning skills, learning trades. You can become an engineer. They go to a black high school. It's about you can get money from college. We're going to teach you how to use computers. You go to a white high school, and you see so many of the white recruits come out of places like Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. It's about patriotism. It's about going overseas and fighting the Muslims. I mean, these are and so they use racial messaging or to try and stereotype. And you'll never find this in writing, of course, but this is how they do it. And it's just one more way to understand just how evil of an institution this is, how dangerous it is, how diabolical it is, and how all is concerned about is its own welfare. It really is a leviathan. It really is a living organism that we have to contend with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's just so remarkable that we'll give free college to people, but you have to be willing to murder people to do it. Like, that's the only way that you get free education. Like, oh, that makes total sense. And I'm curious also, like, as we wrap up, you mentioned that they're not reaching their recruitment numbers. Why do you think that is?
Well, they've actually done their own studies, and the studies were I don't know if they were leaked or if they were publicly disclosed. And a lot of it has to do with fear of death, fear of getting PTSD, as it was described, as well as not wanting to leave family and friends. Republicans in Congress will say it's because the military is too woke, and the studies that came out said that That was the least concern of any of the recruits or potential recruits. So I think a lot of it has to do with the reality of the military that Americans have seen over the years. Parents don't want their children going off to be cannon fodder. Parents don't want their kids going off, coming home with PTSD and traumatic brain injury and moral injury. One of the things, we talk about the violence in Iraq and how violent that war was, and the numbers don't seem to depict how violent it was. 4,500 American soldiers were killed there. Well, that's not a lot. 50,000 were killed in Vietnam. You include 3,500 contractors that were killed there as well, who would have been doing those same jobs in uniform in any previous war before, the great outsourcing and privatization of war began. But even that's not a whole heck of a lot then. But then you look at what they say for the number of traumatic brain injuries. And the VA estimates about 250,000 Iraq and Afghan veterans have traumatic brain injuries from their time in Iraq or Afghanistan. You can't really pull apart the Iraq and Afghan vets because so many of us did, deployments to both places. And in that level of violence then, because the majority of those traumatic brain injuries are from explosive blasts. So you begin to understand the level of violence. What we have vehicle armor and body armor that protected us, that in previous wars, those explosive blasts would have killed us or very, very horribly maimed you. But in these wars, you picked yourself up, dusted yourself off, and moved on. My second deployment in Iraq, when my Marines would go out looking for improvised explosive devices, roadside bombs, I had Marines in a 7-month deployment who were blown up, whose vehicles got hit by IEDs more than 10 times, right? And so we had that protection. And then we had the medical care, which no military in the world has ever had, like what we had in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Iraqi people, of course, had none of that. So you can imagine the violence on their end, what they experienced, and we'll never really fully know. At least 1 million dead. How many millions more wounded? How many psychologically scarred? We don't know. The point, though, is that Americans, I think, understand that level of violence in the terms of knowing people who came home from those wars drastically changed. And that type of understanding, that familiarity with what war does to people, even though we still as a society culturally deny it, I think on the individual or community level, it's understood. And that then translates into this lack of desire, particularly over the last 15 years or so, to join the military. And I think that's one of the reasons why the military has such recruiting problems.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. It's obviously horrific that it's taken this much to pull those numbers down. But so Matt, I do want to ask you, because I do again appreciate that you are uplifting the point that this is an American perspective on this Iraq invasion, as you rightfully put it, not the Iraq war. War also makes it sound like there were like two sides that agreed to go to war or something, as opposed to.
And I say that because Iraqis have taught me that, because Iraqis have taught me that this is the right way. This is the way we look at it, and certainly when you take a step back and you look at the grand scheme of American war and violent meddling against Iraq by the Americans for 50 years, okay, yeah, there really is no point to say that this is the war. This is where an invasion and occupation occurred, certainly, yeah. So, but I get that from Iraqis. I wish I was astute enough or shrewd enough or clever enough to come up with that kind of stuff myself.
Well, I think you are all of those things, but that's it for a different conversation. But it's kind of like the Vietnamese don't call it the Vietnam War, right?
Right, exactly. And that's certainly, I guess we come back to our own perspectives and how we see things. There, I don't know, just as an aside, I don't know if you saw the article that was going around a couple months ago about Afghan Analysts Network, which is a really great collection of journalists and researchers in Afghanistan. They've been there for decades, really committed folks. But they went and they started interviewing some of the Taliban who have now been in Kabul for a year and a half running the government. And it's I think it is what you would expect it to be. These young men, these middle-aged men who were Taliban fighters coming into Kabul and learning that Kabul was not the seat of the devil like they have been told it was. right? And, you know, these conversations where they said, well, I had to go in this room and there were women in there. And then they're okay with it. They find out that these women aren't going to seduce them. They're not these succubuses, right? Or, you know, I mean, that you can, you know, all these types of and then some kind of interesting, funny things where they talk about how, you know, oh, I got to be in at work every day at 8 a.m. and I sit at a computer. It just totally sucks, you know, like that type of like, right? You mean the spoils of victory. And, but it's the it's the ability to understand the other, right? It's that ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I think this is the crux of what we're seeing around the world now with the failure, the disastrous failure. I don't like to use failure because that implies that there might have been some good intent behind it. But the disastrous consequences of the American hegemony, the American unipolar world, you know, where for decades, the United States has refused to allow itself to see the perspective of others, let alone have strategic empathy to think, okay, how might the Chinese react if we keep sailing our aircraft carriers up to their coastline and humiliating them? Oh, they're going to build their own Navy. They're going to increase their nuclear weapons fleet by threefold. Who could have seen that coming, right? Like that type of inability because of our own arrogance, our own ignorance, our hubris, what have you. So yeah, that is, I think, real important, understanding the perceptions of others. It's certainly, I think, with the warfare, with, you know, another term I've come to use for the Iraq, for what occurred in Iraq during the Iraq occupation, is not to use the term insurgency, which, interestingly enough, we were not allowed to use until late 2004, 2005. The senior level of the Department of Defense didn't want to hear that term. And I kind of remember where I was when I heard that we were now allowed to use the word insurgency. And it would have been like late 04, early 05, right? Because insurgency meant there was some legitimacy, that there was some grievance, right, that was valid. But I've since really come to learn, I just heard it again the other day, that itself is inadequate, that the appropriate term would be Iraqi resistance. You know, that resistance is more meaningful to describe the bulk of the insurgency, to even describe many of the foreign fighters who came there from across North Africa, from Saudi Arabia, from Yemen, from all points to fight the American invaders. You know, I certainly had access to the intelligence. I remember reading these at the State Department in 2005 we would capture these young men who would come from these places to fight us in Iraq. And the interrogators would ask, why did you come here? And they said, well, because you invaded. Or they would say, because I saw the photos of Abu Ghraib, or because I saw the photos of Guantanamo Bay. I'm coming to defend my people. And that, of course, plays into you know, some tropes about the continuation of the crusade, and groups like Al-Qaeda and Islamic State then are able to use that for their own narrative. But the vast bulk of the insurgency, I mean, when I was in Iraq in say 04, 05, 06, 07, the Sunni insurgency was about 2 or 3% Al-Qaeda, and the rest of it was nationalist, young men fighting us because we were occupying them, their families and their neighbors supporting them because we were occupying them. So this idea, this use of resistance rather than insurgency, is something I'm really trying to get myself to utilize, because I think it better encapsulates what was occurring there, why they were fighting us, why they were resisting occupation. And I had that moment when I was in Iraq, and I had 153 Marines and sailors, you know, young men in Anbar province. And I remember having this moment where I realized that very clearly. And once I let that thought go, I could never pull it back, of course, right? That if my young men were Anbari young men, that 51 of them would be fighting us, 51 of them would be in Abu Ghraib, and 51 of them would be dead. That there is no difference between my young men and the Iraqi young men we were fighting. And so that perception, having that ability to understand how you would act in similar circumstances, if you had not been born in New Jersey as I was, but if you were born in Haditha, say, yeah, I think that unfortunately comes late to us, to many of us. And then there's a resistance as well in accepting that further causes us to deny that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm reminded of I was reading a memoir of a Swedish man who went down to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and he said that he was asked when he came home why he went down there, and he just replied, because fascism.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, you're an imperialist invading force. I mean, that's my answer.
Yeah.
And I'm also reminded, I'm going to try to find her name. I think it's, Marjane Satrapi, who's a French-Iranian novelist and illustrator and film director. She spoke about how the similarities between Iranians and Americans are great, and the far greater than the similarities between you and your government and me and my government.
Right. Right.
And our governments are very much the same. And
Right.
I always remember that line, like, yeah, we are the cannon fodder, but we are the ones who really should be sitting in the no man's land having a coffee together.
That's right. Yeah.
So finally, with that, you mentioned that outlet that interviewed the members of the Taliban. I'm also curious if you have suggestions, because, like I mentioned, sometimes it can feel overwhelming. Like, okay, well, I am a U.S. citizen, or I live in the U.S. Where do I go for a perspective from an Iraqi, from people in Afghanistan or Iraq? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Oh gosh. Off the top of my head, I think, what's stuck in my head right now is there's a Twitter account, and this is difficult. I just want to let people know it's difficult. Called Fallujah Birth Effects, and it's a Twitter account that's what it does. It tweets out photos and stories of the children who are being born every day, and they'll be born like this for generations, just as occurred in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam because of our poisoning of their countries through our war. The people of Iraq are experiencing the same thing. And, you hear different numbers about this, but the only thing is that it is occurring, that every day these children, countless mothers are giving birth to children that are stillborn or born with very difficult to look at deformities, and they die soon after, or they live lives where they are reduced to because of their deformities. And this is because we poisoned their water and their land. Dozens of Iraqis are still being killed every month in political violence. This is something that I think most Americans don't know. I'm not talking about Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi police, Iraqi paramilitaries, or ISIS, or any of that. We're talking about regular, just families being killed, dozens of people every month in political violence. It has not ended. But even if we had, millions are still homeless. The last count I saw was from a couple of years ago, but 8 million Iraqis were still refugees, either internally displaced or externally. The equivalent number in the U.S. would be about 75 or 80 million Americans being homeless because of that. Put in those numbers. But even if we had a wand and took care of all that, and the political instability and the violence was put to rest, for generations, they are going to suffer, the Iraqis, because their children are going to die because we poisoned their water and their land. And I think that is the most significant and endearing legacy of all that we're talking about. What we have done to children that haven't even been born yet. A child born a year from now in Iraq will die because of the U.S. invasion and occupation, even though it was at that point 20 years past, right? Because how we poisoned their water and land. And so, I think that is what weighs and should weigh heavy on our nation, as a conscience. And the fact that we can go this week and I have not seen anything about reparations being spoken about, except from Iraqi authors. That's the only people I see. I've not seen any American voices. There are some out there, obviously, of course, but in terms of prominence, in the corporate media or anything, suggesting anything remotely close to any degree of reparations to at least try and bring about some degree of assistance or comfort to the Iraqi people.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I think the question of reparations is oftentimes just considered to be an internal United States question, as opposed to reparations for the the survivors and victims of our imperialist hegemonic violence. So Matt, thank you so much for sharing so much. I very much appreciate it. Where can folks follow your work and what you're up to now?
So I work with a group called the Eisenhower Media Network. You can Google that and it'll come right up. Also on Twitter, you can find me at Matthew P. Hoh, P as in Patrick, last name spelled H-O-H. And I also have a Substack, moved my old blog over to Substack like everyone else is doing. And it's, I don't know, it's like Matthew Hoh .substack got something or other, but same thing. You Google it and you'll find it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Eleanor.